Welcome to the 7th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of generating a report containing important details on each of the data sources maintained on your Tableau server. I'll show you how to query your Tableau server for information on each data source using Tableau Server Client and subsequently write that information to an Excel workbook. Before jumping into the coding aspect of this video, allow me to speak to this type of report's use cases. A data sources report allows you to understand what your Tableau server looks like in terms of data sources. It allows you to answer questions like, how many total data sources does our Tableau server currently contain? How many data sources are owned by each user? Which user owns each data source? What are the details of each data source? When was each data source created and last updated? What is the data source type? Is it an Excel data source? Is it connected to a relational database, etc.? Do any data sources currently have data quality issues? If so, which ones? It is critical to ensure that data sources contain accurate data and are being updated at the expected frequency to ensure downstream consumers of that data are not negatively affected. For this example, I'm going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all data sources existing on the server. After retrieving that list of data source objects, I will start by creating a simple report that provides important details on each data source. I will then further develop the structure and contents of this report by incorporating what you learned in my previous video on generating a user's report to include each data source owner's details within the report. At the end of this walkthrough, I will show you how to write the report to an Excel file for reporting and dissemination purposes. The first step I need to take is to configure my connection to the Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. After configuring the connection details, I can begin working towards a solution that will generate the desired data sources report. I need to use the Tableau Server Client object I configured in the first code block to sign in. I've went ahead and started off the second code block by doing just that. I'm using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. Alright, to begin, let's go ahead and run this code block that is responsible for configuring my Tableau Server Client object. The next step we're going to take is we're going to sign into the server and gather a list of all data source objects maintained on my server using the data sources endpoint. Again, to reiterate what we're doing here, we're going to create a list of all the data source objects maintained on my server by communicating with the data sources endpoint. Let's go ahead and run this. The next step is we're going to gather a list of all the users maintained on the server as well. And why are we doing this? Well, the user information is not stored within the data source object. The only attribute that is maintained for a data source object that is directly related to a user is going to be the unique ID of that user. In order to get the user's name, email address, their site role, etc., we're going to need to merge these objects, each of these objects, based on the owner ID in the data source object and the user ID in the user object. So we need both of these objects to give a complete picture in this report. So let's say users is equal to user for user in tsc.pager server.users. So we're doing the same exact thing we did with the data sources, except we're going to access the user's endpoint. Okay, the next step I want to take is let's go ahead and take a look at each of these lists of objects. So the first one we generated was the data source list. So let's take a look at that. You'll notice here we have a list of data source objects. So I have 6 objects, so 6 data sources. And let's take a look at the attributes that are maintained for each of these. To do that, I'm going to access the first data source object in this list and then just spit out the dictionary representation of these key value pairs. Okay, so we have quite a few attributes. Here in a moment, we're going to determine which attributes we actually want to be included in our report. This just allows you to take a look at what are the possible things that you can extract from each of these objects for reporting purposes. Next thing, let's go ahead and look at the users list. So similar to the data sources list, we're going to have a list of objects, and in this case, it's a user objects. There are only 2 users on my server. They're both tied to me, just simply different email addresses. And let's also look at the attributes that are stored for each of these. All right, so fewer attributes, but nonetheless containing important information for our report. Now we have the ID, so the unique ID for the user, the domain name, the email, full name, site role, etc. We're going to use a few of these attributes in our report. So let's go ahead and start creating our reports. And how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to create a data frame for each of these objects, or list of objects. So what we're going to do is we're going to say data source info. This is going to be my data frame for my data sources. I'm going to say equals, and then I'm going to say pd.dataframe. And then let's begin constructing this data frame using key value pairs. So I'm going to make my columns report friendly. I'm not going to use the attribute names that you see like here, right? So these are the user attributes, but nonetheless you see that underscore workbooks is probably not what people want to see in a report. Same thing with like full name or underscore site role. So let's make these a little bit better. And what I'll do here really quickly, just so we can see it, is I'm going to put the data sources attributes back up on our screen. Okay, so the things that I think are important are going to be the data source ID, so that's going to be just purely ID, and I'm going to call that data source ID. And let's go ahead and make sure we have quotes around here. And I am going to use list comprehension to extract each of the data source IDs for each data source and place those in a list. So I'm going to say data source.id for data source in data sources. So again, what I'm doing is for each of the data sources in our list of data source objects, I'm going to extract the IDs and place those in a list. What I'm going to do for the rest of these columns is I'm simply going to copy and paste. So everything that I need after this is more or less going to contain minor modifications to this first line we've created here, this first column. So the next column I want is a data source owner ID. So who owns the data source? So the data source owner ID. And to get this, we can use owner ID. So we'll say .owner ID. Do the same thing. What else do we need? Let's get the name. That seems pretty darn important. And that should actually be, okay, it should be name. Okay. And let's go with the data source type. So is this connected to an Excel file? Is it connected to a MySQL database? Is it connected to an Amazon Aura instance? What have you? Let's go ahead and put that here. This is a piece of critical information. And I believe that is actually not type, it's data source type. Yes. So let's go ahead and put that there. New underscore. And then let's do the created date and updated date. The created at, in this case. And the updated at. And we'll fix these. So created at, updated at, okay. And then what else do we need? So we have the ID, so the unique identifier that we're going to use for the data source to tie it to other objects. In this case, we're not going to use that to tie it to users. We're actually going to tie each of these data source objects using the owner ID. So this is the user ID that we're going to get from the users objects. We have the data source name, that's important. The type, when the data sources are created and updated at. Let's also put in the project ID and the project name. So where is this data source maintained at on our Tableau server? Project is Tableau's word for what we would commonly refer to as a folder in our file system. So the data source project ID, Let's also do data source project name. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this and then update the attribute that's being extracted. So let's say project ID and project name. Okay, remove this comma, don't need that. All right, so what this is going to do is it's going to create a data frame that contains one row per data source and the corresponding attributes. So data source ID, owner ID, name, type, created at, updated at, project ID, and project name. And we're doing this by using list comprehension to extract each of those values or attributes for each data source and representing those in a single row. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. All right, executed successfully. And let's look at, let's take a look at it. All right, so as expected, we have one row per data source, or 6 data sources, and then the corresponding attributes that we specified. All right, so now the next step we need to do is we need to do the same thing we just did here, but with the user info. What I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna say, create a data frame containing data source information. And then let's just do the same thing down here. Containing user information. All right, so I'm going to say user info equals, let's just do the exact same thing, right? So PD data frame. Provide a list of key value pairs for the preferred column name or attribute name. And let's do, for users, let's do the user ID. We definitely need that because that's how we're going to tie each of the data sources back to a user. Let's do the user display name. And let's do the user email address. And the user site role. All right. So to do this, again, we're going to use list comprehension. I'm going to say user.id for user and users. And then we'll do the exact same thing, except we're going to change out the attributes, right? So I'm going to say, so the display name, that's actually going to be the full name that's displayed on the server. And the email is just going to be email. And the site role is just user.site role for user and users. This isn't stuff you have to memorize, of course, right? I didn't memorize this. I was basically looking at this, right? So I was looking at users 0. Right, so I got that information from here, right? The key names or the attributes that we're extracting for each user, I got that directly from here. So there's no need to memorize this stuff, and there's also documentation online, so no need at all to memorize this stuff. Okay, so we have our user info data frame, and we have our data source data frame, so let's just take a look at the user info data frame. And as expected, we have one row per user, and the corresponding display name, email address, and site role. Again, we're going to use this user ID, so this is the locally unique identifier for each of the users. We're going to use this user ID to tie the user to the data sources that are maintained on my server by finding the values that match, or so the instances of matches between owner ID and user ID. And how are we going to do that? So using Pandas, what we're going to do is we're going to use the merge method. So I'm going to say, let's just comment this. And I won't use the SQL term, I'll use the Pandas term. So merge data source info and user info data frames. Let's do data sources report. So this is going to be our report, and it's going to be the result of merging these two data frames together. So I'm going to say data source info dot merge. How are we going to merge this, and what is the right table? So if we're starting off with data source info, that's going to be the left table. The right table is going to be the user info table. And how do we want to merge this? Let's do enter. So I'm only going to want data sources that are maintained or have been created by an active user on the server. Technically, it's not possible for there to be a data source on the server that is tied to a user that is not on your server. Whenever you're offboarding users on Tableau Server, before you can fully delete the user, you actually have to migrate all their content to another user. So why am I telling you this? The reason I'm telling you this is because I'm going to use an inner join, because I know that it's an impossibility for there to be a data source on the server that is not tied to an existing user. You can't have like a ghost data source on the server. Okay, so left on. So how are we merging these two data frames? So on our left table, our data source info table, or our data source info data frame, is data source owner ID. And our right, so the key on the right table, is the user ID. Again, these are the two attributes that are going to allow us to tie data sources to users and vice versa, users to data sources. So that's how we're going to merge these two data frames. And then, so we've done the merge. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to chain a few things. So I'm going to chain a few transformations. The first thing I want to do is I want to drop the redundant user ID column. So we'll drop that column because I'm going to have the data source owner ID column, right? I don't need two columns containing the same information. All right, and then what I want to do is I'm going to rename some of these columns. And to rename these columns, I'm going to just provide key value pairs. So these key value pairs are going to be the old column name, and the value is going to be the replacement column name. So the old column name that I want to replace is user display name. So there's going to be a few of these. There's going to be 3 of these that I want to do. I also want to rename user email address to data source owner email address. So the reason I'm doing this is to make it very explicit. You know, what does this attribute contain? Well, it contains the email address corresponding to the owner of the data source. Okay, so user site role and data source owner site role. Okay, so I've renamed these columns here. You could have very well created your user info data frame with those attribute names. So you could have said data source owner name here, right? But in this tutorial, I decided to just stick with these attributes. So calling it a user ID, user display name, etc. And then change it down here just for clarity so that we know that this user info data frame is, or it represents the users on my server, not the data sources on my server. Okay. So you can do that operation earlier, or you can do it down here. It doesn't matter. Or you can do it not at all, right? If you don't want to rename, if you don't even want these columns in your data sources report. All right. So the next thing I want to do is, well, let's just look at this, right? Let's go ahead and look at this this data sources report before we continue any further. All right. So our data sources report contains 1 row per data source. We now have the data source information and the corresponding user information. So if we look here, we have the data source ID, the owner ID. So this is the unique identifier tied to the user object. We have the data source name, the type, the created dates, the updated dates, the project ID, the project name. And then we have the data source owner name. So this owner name is tied to this data source owner ID. Same thing with the email address and the same thing with the site role. Now, when I think about reading this report, I think that some of these columns could be moved around and make this a little bit easier to read. And if not easier to read, at least columns that seemingly belong together will be next to each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-index this, and that's just Pandas' word for let's rearrange these columns. So I'm going to say re-index. And then what do I want to do here? I want to change the order of these columns. So I'm going to say re-index, and then I'm going to say columns is equal to a list. So this is going to be the order in which I represent these columns in the data frame. It's just going to be moving these things around. So I'm going to explicitly mention that here in order. So I want the data source ID, the data source name, the data source type, data source created at, So if you notice, I'm listing all of the attributes directly tied to the data source first here. Okay, so that was a fun typing exercise. Let's see if I typed everything correctly. All right, so I did. So you'll notice that the columns have been rearranged, and we started off with the data source column, so the attributes that are directly tied to the data source. Then we went to the project attributes. So where does this data source sit within my server? So in this instance, we have 5 data sources that are in a data sources folder. And we have 1 that's in a samples folder. And then I continued on with the attributes corresponding to the user that owns that data source. So I find this far easier to consume if you're going to consume this in an Excel workbook or even in a BI tool than having, these columns just spread out randomly. So you have a data source attribute followed by an owner attribute or a user attribute followed by a project attribute. It just doesn't make any sense. All right. So we have our data sources report. Now, one thing that you are going to realize if you try to write this to Excel is that if you don't remove the time zone information from these timestamps, it's going to give you an error. At least using Pandas, it will give you an error. So what I want to do here is I want to remove the time zone information. And to do that, I'm just going to update these 2 attributes here. So let's just say remove time zone information from created at and updated at attributes. All right, to do that, I'm going to say data sources. There's actually a few ways you could do this. I'm just going to do it in the most straightforward and elementary way that I know. So I'm just going to edit these columns. So localize this and then none. So no time zone information. What I'm going to do the other attribute, I'm just going to copy and paste this. There's no reason to retype all of that if I'm just going to change out these 2 attributes. So I'm going to say updated at and updated it. And then let's just take a look at this again. All right, so the time zone information has been removed. Now I will be able to successfully write this to an Excel file. How am I going to do that? Well, to do that, I'm just going to jump down to this block that I dedicated to writing that. And we'll do that down here. So we have our data sources report, but why do we want to write this somewhere or upload this somewhere? Well, it doesn't do anyone any good and doesn't really do much good for me if it just sits in this IDE, right? It sits in my editor. So I need to be able to disseminate this to other users. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to put this in an Excel workbook. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And to do that, I'm going to use pathlib. You may have noticed at the beginning here that I've imported pathlib. You're probably thinking, well, why is he doing that? Well, I'm doing that to make use of the library to create a path object. I'm going to say write path is equal to pathlib.path, and then provide a file path. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy and paste the file path from my machine, so I don't have to type this all out. All right, and then what do I want to call this file? So I'm putting the file in this directory, tutorial 7. What I want to call the file, I'm going to call this data sources report, followed by an underscore. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to append the date and time for which this report was generated. The reason you might want to do this is to avoid overwriting a data sources report that you previously executed or generated. And you'll want to be able to distinguish one data source report from another. Say you run one today, you run one next week, you run one next month. You want to be able to know when that report was generated based just on the file name. You won't always have the timestamp information that's available on the operating system, right? So let's go ahead and do that. And to do that, I'm going to append a piece of code that I use quite frequently for these scripts. I'm just going to copy and paste that here now. What this does is it appends the date and time to this file name. The time is going to be in UTC, and it's going to be formatted in this format. So this is the format model. So it's 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day, followed by the hours, minutes, and seconds. And with the right path specified, let's go ahead and begin writing the data sources report to that path. So to do that, let's say with.pd Excel writer. And we're going to say write path. So where am I writing this to? As writer. So data sources report .to Excel using the writer object. What do we want to call the sheets? Let's go ahead and call it data sources as opposed to the default sheet 1. And then index is equal to false. So why am I using index equal to false? If I don't say index is equal to false, what we're going to see in our data sources reports, we're going to see a column that is quite redundant when you think about Excel. So there's going to be a column that contains the numbers 0 through 5 in it, which is going to be Panis's row numbering system, right? But we already have Excel's, right? So we have Excel's built-in row numbering system along the left-hand side of our worksheet. So I'm not going to include that redundant column. Let's go ahead and write this now by running this block of code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to Excel. Let me open up the Excel file we just wrote. And here's our data sources report. So we have one row per data source, and captured within each row are the data source details, along with the details behind the owner of the data source. Let's switch back over to Visual Studio to just recap what we've done here. All right, so we started off by creating the Tableau Server Client object, and then subsequently we signed in. After signing in, we used the data sources endpoint and the users endpoint to retrieve a list of all data source objects and user objects maintained on my server. We then took those objects, those list of objects, and created a data frame for each, extracting the necessary attributes from each data source object. After we had two data frames, one for the data source objects and one for the user objects, we merged those two data frames so that we're able to answer questions like, how many data sources does Chris own? Or who owns this data source? And what are the details of that owner? Say the email address, their site's role. After that, we did the necessary step of removing the time zone from the two attributes created at and updated at so that we're able to write these to Excel. Here's our data frame, or our data sources report. That is the result of merging those two data frames, the user info and the data source info. After that, we wrote the data sources report to an Excel file. And that is the report that you see on screen now. All right, that wraps up this video on generating a data sources report. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server through automation. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.